Welcome viewers to the latest episode of the Huddle, and welcome back to returning viewers. Today, Tim Poole here, editor of Gambling Insider. I'll be speaking with Philip Bugeja, partner at IGA Group, and we'll be talking about the importance of AML and CFT compliance. But when I say importance, we're delving into why it really matters and not just at a surface level. Philip, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Looking forward to talking about, all things compliance, AML, CFT, very important topics in the gaming industry. To start off with a little bit about yourself, can you tell us about your background and how you ended up here in your role at the IGA Group?
Okay, so my background is mainly in relation to anti-money laundering. I graduated in criminology, was something I had a passion for. Through time, through experiences, served as an MLRO for a number of entities, and basically then the opportunity came up to join as a partner with the IGA Group. And we decided to set up something which was a little bit different, which is on the consultancy level, but to help monitor, help shadow clients a little bit more and provide a little bit of a more of a proactive approach towards money laundering, how it's being tackled, keeping things commercially viable. Obviously, from my years of experience, we noticed certain gaps in the industry. We noticed also certain gaps in the implementation of rules and regulations. So our aim and the setup for IGML was specifically to address those gaps and ensure that our clients meet the regulatory compliance.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. On that note, I want to open up a discussion on, AML, CFT, and it might sound silly at first because I want to ask how important is it, but I ask that kind of with a almost a slightly deeper meaning in that obviously it's important, but does the gaming industry and do companies, when they're going through compliance procedures, do they truly understand just how important it is, if that makes sense?
It does to a certain extent. So it is important. Obviously, it's part of the legislation. That the legislation is there, it's meant to be followed. So there's no argument on the importance of it. It's black and white, needs to be done. Now, whether the companies embrace it's important, that's a different story. Mm-hmm. The industry needs to understand, even the companies need to understand that its importance is a twofold. It's important, obviously, from a regulatory perspective to meet the obligations, to avoid any penalties and whatnot. But there's also the other end of it, which is the actual part where you are preventing money laundering, preventing terrorist activities. We know what happens in these situations, especially when we're dealing with terrorist activities. We're dealing with situations that could possibly lead to a loss of life. So there is a twofold approach to your question. So yes, it is important, and yes, it's important from the other side as well, when you're seeing the larger scale of things, and also when you're trying to disrupt, to a certain extent, illegal activity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When it comes to the approaches companies can take, what kind of risk-based approaches can they use kind of when it comes to these, as you say, pretty important areas?
So let's break that question down a little bit more.
It's a broad one, yeah.
It's a very broad one. So we always suggest that things are kept commercially viable. It does not mean that by keeping something commercially viable, you are not meeting the regulatory requirements in relation to AML. It is a little bit harder to do because you'll need to understand more and more about the business, understand the stakeholders as well, understand that your business ultimately is a business. It ends up not being a tick box approach where basically I have the regulation and I'm just ticking the boxes just to make sure that everything is correct. It needs a little bit more work when it comes to ensuring that clients are retained, the level of questioning to certain clients, having a proper risk-based approach will allow you even to focus on areas that really matter. Emphasizing also on the part where the risk-based approach actually is a twofold. You've got the business risks and you've got the client risks, which is two separate assessments. When you're dealing with client risk assessments, what exactly are you going to assess? What are you going to build in their profile? When you're dealing with a business risk, it's understanding the direction the company wants to go, keeping the regulations in place, getting tools, programs, and even developing a compliance program, which does make sense, creates a flow to the business, ensures that there's business continuity, ensures that there's commercial viability. So it's very, very different. The main problems we see these days is when it comes to the implementation. Most common we see that when it comes to the interpretation of the actual law, when it comes to the interpretation of two typologies and trends, We believe, and I believe mostly, that these documents are there to set a mindset, to set a trail of thought, formulate the idea. They're not there to be a tick box approach. If one were to follow a tick box approach, unfortunately, the slightest deviation in the execution of something might not be noticed. So if we take a simple example, let's take a hot topic right now, tax evasion, and let's say someone deposits with a company account can constitute tax evasion. If you were to follow that by the letter, you'd make a mess. So it is there, it's an idea, you need to understand it, but you need to understand even the interpretation of it as well. So when you're coming up with a risk-based approach, it's very, very important to understand what data can you collect? How factual is it? Could it be a little bit manipulated? Is the data the client providing only and can't be verified to a certain extent? So it takes quite a lot to ensure that you have a successful operation, meeting regulatory requirements, and at the end of the day, keeping your operation commercially viable because it is a business.
I'm glad you mentioned the phrase, tick box approach, because when I was asking, how important is this really, that's kind of one of the aspects I was getting at, in the sense that, it might be very easy for any hypothetical CEO or business decision maker to look at compliance and just have a natural instinct of resistance, like, oh, this is something I have to do. Let's do as little as we can of it just to meet the rules, because ultimately, in the wider picture, that doesn't help the business.
Exactly. That is unfortunately the stage we are in now, and I think it's a mentality change that needs to change. Ultimately, it shouldn't be seen as something that is a business inhibitor. If you do anti-money laundering correctly to the point, I'm not saying it's not going to be an obstacle, because there's always an obstacle in it, but it shouldn't be that element of the business which is seen as a showstopper. It should be seen there to complement. It should be seen that we're keeping up the business safe to a certain extent. If it wasn't there, let's say something happens and it was done or carried out because of your negligence, I think that would feel much worse on an operator rather than anything else. Because to make a couple of euros on one side, it ended up in something devastating on the other. So they should walk hand in hand. It should be complemented. And I always believe that although there are strict regulations on anti-money laundering, they need to walk and they need to be adapted to the business in question. I can't say, in fact, this is what we tell our clients as well. No two clients are alike. Your players are not my players. The companies, if you're operating in certain jurisdictions, other might not. So it's very important that things are tailored and things are understood, and that research is carried out, and the research on the company itself and on the players, trends, and typologies you have is carried out as well. That will give you your framework. This is just like a haircut. Not every haircut suits everyone, so this is the same thing.
Yeah, good analogy. When it comes to non-compliance, so let's say an operator has unfortunately taken the approach of maybe there was some negligence, as you say, somewhere along the line. What are the true repercussions here? Because obviously there are sanctions. It can be financial, but then there's reputational damage as well. There's a bit more of a cost associated with this than just the physical cost.
Let's remove the element of a cost, because a cost is a cost. We've all gotten a ticket in our life. We paid it. We're done. So it's a cost. We need to understand that non-compliance is very easy to achieve, actually. It's just put out the way it is. If you don't want to comply, it's very easy to achieve. In my opinion, it provides a very, very unfair advantage over the companies rather than companies who are adhering to the rules and regulations, because obviously it's one less thing to do. So it's a twofold. If we need to see it from a perspective that non-compliance obviously can lead to heavy detrimental. It's very detrimental to a company. It's not only the publication of the name, then you're facing obviously negative media. It could affect your suppliers. We've seen this happen in the past as well, affecting suppliers, affecting payment providers. It could lead to a domino effect. Again, depending on the strength of the company, depending on the financial position on the company, everyone can absorb the blow at different levels. At the end of the day, we've seen companies which have been repeatedly sort of being fined. and unfortunately things remain as is. So it is all about striking the right balance. If you're not going to strike the right balance, and if AML is going to be and safety is going to be seen in a perspective that it's a business inhibitor, then unfortunately nothing's going to change. Unless anti-money laundering, obviously with new rules, regulations are interpreted correctly, and the person implementing those regulations is doing it hand in hand with the business, that will eventually create a mentality change. It doesn't happen overnight. I think you remember back in our days when we used to install the games, they used to take ages and the setup and the installation. It should follow the same pattern. So there's the setup, there's the understanding, you're learning the controls of it, just like a game. Once you have it fully installed, then it will work and should work perfectly. But there are the levels, and the levels that can be harder and harder. So to put that in context.
Yeah, I mean, looking at that kind of hypothetical situation described, what about a company that, you know, it becomes an industry giant or whatever, it's a huge company, and it can just afford to pay a big fine and move on? You know, I guess my question is, what are the risks of that? Because it might be all too easy. We can afford the fine, no worries. Slap on the wrist, we move on. But everything you've described earlier in terms of the process, that's still, you know, damage to the company.
So there are going to be those situations, just like in any industry, where the slapping of a fine is not going to mean anything because there's affordability for it. It is something that obviously is taken seriously, but unfortunately, there is also regulations which, if the fine is going to keep on being repetitive, then there are other steps which can be taken depending on the jurisdiction you're operating in. So it never theoretically ends there with a fine. There's always a remediation. You need to prove that the remediation is effective. So there's always something which can be lacking. Obviously, what regulators need to understand as well, that the industry is volume-based. Having and knowing everything about every player, unfortunately, will never happen. And now this is not going against the regulation or going against the authorities, but it's an understanding which I think is common frustration amongst other MLROs in the industry. We depend on employees, we depend on our colleagues. You can't do everything on your own. You can't ensure that everything you can to a certain level, that no one did the slightest mistake in any angle, just like any other business. Unfortunately, these things do happen. It comes from the regulator perspective as well, to understand the industry, get proper understanding of the industry, how it works, how it operates, sort of what are the common failures in the industry, and address those. We all have our hardships with the regulation, irrelevant of the jurisdiction, and those need to be tackled, in my opinion, hand in hand with the regulator, and where the industry, it's not because sometimes they don't want to, where they can't meet certain requirements, or where it's an element of human error, then those are to be addressed accordingly, and addressed accordingly with the regulators. And it's very important. I always suggest good communication, the jurisdiction you're operating within. So if there is something which you require to change or require better understanding, do reach out to the regulators. Most are more than happy to assist.
Absolutely. The role of the regulator and regulation obviously plays its part, but I do feel if we were to address that, that's a whole other interview in itself. You know, that's a whole aspect of it. If we were to look at the you know, again, operators, and this is something I'm sure you can speak to in terms of experience and expertise, but can compliance be done and conducted but incorrectly? So not non-compliance, but compliance, but it's wrong in a way. Yeah.
Very easy, actually. We encounter it more often than you think. So basically, we do carry out certain audits where we have very confident MLROs, but once you start analyzing and getting into a little bit of detail, you start to understand that the application was all incorrect. All in good faith, don't get me wrong, but the application would be incorrect. And again, we don't do this to show that we're any better than anyone else. For us, the better our companies do, or the better the audits are, the better it is for us, better it gives an understanding, the more reassurance we have on the company. Obviously, our clients, we do not want them to get penalized. So it is on us as well to ensure that everything is being done correctly, and is being done, again, in a way that is commercially viable for the company. So yes, we do. Usually when we get these situations, as we said before, are when there is inadequate implementation of the legislation, or it is done exactly to the letter, or the persons do not have the adequate training or experience in the field. Another problem we see is when individuals carry on what they had in their previous job. This is something I never suggest. Do your study, get up to date, do your research, understand the industry. Crime is something that is changing. It's constantly evolving. We've got countless numbers of new frauds per week, different types, new technology, different trends. So what you had and what you did 10 years ago, unfortunately, these days isn't valid. Most things we see is that, I used to do this in my previous company. That might not work in this company. So whatever you did before, although it serves as a base and it's good to understand what happened in the past, you need to evolve with it. You can't carry on doing what you were doing 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Certain forms need to change. Regulations changed drastically over the past few years. They're going to be changing again in the future. We've seen the AMLRs, the new AMLA, the sixth directive as well. So it's constantly evolving. And the reason why it's constantly evolving is that crime is constantly evolving as well. So
Yeah.
you need to move hand in hand and better understand the industry, where you're operating in, how it's operating, whether the company operates in certain jurisdictions other than others. That's why, again, reiterating to what I said before, it's important to understand the company you're working for. Even when there's a change in role, no two companies are alike. They
Yeah.
could be similar, they could offer the same things, but you need the mindset of that company. This is where it delves deep. Even what we do with most of our clients, that's something we try to set up. That the framework, the compliance management, the whole function, the operational flow, the contact is specific for that company. Now you can
Yeah.
tell me if the regulation is as is, so it has to be the same. Yes, it will. But maybe the wording can differ. Maybe in a certain jurisdiction, you can give way with certain things and obtain from somewhere else. So that pattern for us is what makes a company both compliant and ensures a successful operation. If the marketing is right, if they have the right tools in place, if they have the right attitude, that's a guaranteed recipe for success.
Yeah, that's a notable bit of practical advice, and it goes back to your sort of, in a serious way, your haircut analogy. You said no job is the same, no company is the same. Even if it's a slight difference, a little bit on the side, it's a whole new ball game, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Completely correct.
Yes. You mentioned a few kind of the directives that are coming in and things that are changing. But look, on the top level, looking at 2025 in this area, which is a constant area, so it's not going to suddenly change massively. But as you say, it's always evolving. In the year ahead, what are the kind of main trends that operators and perhaps even regulators can look out for?
So it's a very, very, very complex question to answer. I can't predict the future, and I can't say, obviously, there's the regulations which are in place. It depends on the company as well. So I can't say, the common thing this year is going to be. So we've had different types of trends through times. We've had trends where people of certain age were being used. So the past can only give us an indication into what might possibly happen going forward. So if we had to look at the past few years and how things are going to evolve going forward, I don't think much is going to change. It's more the execution that is going to change, and the execution of committing certain crimes, which is going to change. I don't expect to see, obviously, as I said, crime is constantly evolving, but the predicate offenses are ultimately the same. So if we're discussing fraud was before being done through stolen cars, then became to stealing bank IDs, then it became to buying IDs on the web or on the dark web, then it became to going to people, offering them payment for an exchange for use of their ID. So it's more, I wouldn't say there is a direct way in which companies can be affected. There could be, but from sort of our typologies analysis and what is, it just needs to be up to date. Once you realize, understand the new typologies, understand how they can implement it, different ways they can be implemented. If you're running that exercise within your company and specifically for your company, then you will understand better what you can be targeted for. Obviously, companies have an obligation to do their business risk assessment, which is in certain jurisdictions a yearly commitment. So better understanding what risk factors you can be subject to, and better understanding where you operate, how you operate, payment methods being used, jurisdictions, understanding your clients, that could give you an indication to what you are subject to or what could possibly happen in the next year. Obviously, if you've been targeted in previous years and you have some quantitative data on what happened in the past, this should give you a clear indication of what might possibly happen in the future as well.
Mhm. I want to sort of address a final area. You mentioned earlier, and we both kind of touched on, the mentality that's needed to kind of implement the correct compliance for processes to be, a company-wide and that kind of thing, and differ from company to company, role to role. When it comes to that mentality within the industry, do you see, is it changing? Is it going in the right direction? And perhaps when I asked about 2025 and that being quite a complex question, this is a little bit more specific. Do you see are you seeing kind of from people across the industry the right mentality being implemented, even if it's slight increases here and there? Is it going in the right direction?
So throughout the years, I've been in the field for over 9 years now. There has been a very, very steep increase. So you had those years where it was seen as something which wasn't taken that seriously, but obviously as time ramped up, the seriousness of the matter kept being pushed and pushed. Some people thought at the time, I remember, that's just a period and it might blow away, but as time progressed, it became stronger and stronger and stronger. There has also been the issues of penalties then, and companies being made public because they had deficiencies. So that even continued to strengthen that lesson. This is here to stay. We need to have a good plan in place. So from an AML perspective, I think we're on the right direction. There's always an increase. It's always on top of the agenda. Let's say it this way, people are not afraid of it, but they're more concerned about it to prevent crimes, to prevent the company as well. So as I said before, it's a twofold approach. It's not only just to meet the regulation, let's go. It's even changing from a human element. What am I actually preventing? Am I going to make a difference? Is my company actually making a difference? Am I stopping the right people? Am I preventing certain crimes from happening? And this should fill the companies with certain pride as well, especially if you're major players. And it should fill with certain pride that, yes, we are managing to make a difference. We are stopping what shouldn't be stopped. People who are obviously on the illegal side are actually getting what they deserve. So it's a twofold approach. There is always a little bit of fear, though, through the companies, obviously, of reputation damage, any penalties, doing their utmost and still getting a penalty for it. So that's where we provide also from our side a little bit of a reassurance on, listen, things are all right. We do get, and we're lucky that recently we've been working with some really good people as well, which really take the roles. Companies are very, very supportive to the role as well. We've seen even very good investments into AML units, and the setup is being correct, obviously not being overly demanding and then ending up being a little bit too much, where you get the right structure in place and you get the right balance between what you're stopping and what you're going through. So, yeah, I'd have to say, going forward, I think it's something which is on the increase and will continue to be on the increase. And I think even with recent legislations and even guidance from the authorities as time went by, it provided a little bit more reassurance to the MLROs. There are still some gray areas which do provide quite a challenge to undertake. But going forward, I think due to clarity, due to collaboration, due to correspondence, and creating, let's call it an ecosystem where everyone's working together and ultimately we're all working for the same goal, I think things will only improve from here on.
Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic. Overall, thank you very much for your time, Philip. Really enjoyed speaking with you. Really interesting discussion. I mean, as we say, it's an important topic, and there's plenty more we can. I'm sure we'll speak again on it. But yeah, heading into 2025, and in 2025, as you say, a lot of positive signs.
Thank you very much for having me, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, and to our viewers, as always, thanks for watching as well.